Thank you very much for attending my presentation. I can't really imagine how interesting it may sound on a virtual meeting to come to something about industry task forces. Therefore, I appreciate even more the fact that you're here, that you're listening. And I'd like to try to make this entertaining for you because a virtual meeting can be long, series after series of presentations, sitting at your home or at your desk. And I just want to be sincere and give you some good information and move on from there. So I'd like to talk to you about the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force, FESTF, FESTF, as some of us call us ourselves. We've been around since 1996, and we've definitely been dealing in an area of changing scenery, unusual challenges, and the task of communicating under cultures that are from different agencies in multiple kinds of ways. So what I'd like to do is give you a sort of a who, what, when, where, and how background on the task force, so what we are, what we did, why it's even around, and how it has played throughout the very complicated time of trying to mature the consultation process between FIFRA, the act that regulates pesticides, and the Endangered Species Act that regulates protection of rare species. So what are we? All task forces formed under FIFRA normally are data development task forces organized to address information that is required for the industry as a whole. It's a collaboration between companies to put forth that information and address location, in this case, location data requirements. Our efforts to examine these data began in 1993, actually through CropLife America, when regulations were put upon individual licenses or pesticide registrations as an action that was interpreted to mean there was an endangered species need for consultation, because the action of registering a national label was considered an action by a federal agency that required endangered species review. In the first way of looking at providing that kind of data that the agency explored was to look specifically at endangered species location data. So in response, as industry typically does, they tried to find an efficient way to provide that to EPA, to provide a depth of data that would be meaningful. And they did that. Of course, in 1996, we didn't have all of the geospatial platforms we have today. We were still working in a paper world, in a map world. And we submitted in 1996 a paper-based feasibility study that was done in the Midwest to look at the relationships between pesticide use and, excuse me, endangered species that were in that area. It was huge. It was bulky. It was horrible to review. And it was not meaningful once it was submitted and 6 months old, because everything changes. So it's not as simple as it sounds to try to do something that seems to be simple, like comparing where a species might be and where a crop might be. And one of the reasons for that is it became obvious that the data that we needed and the information that the agency needed to inform an assessment were constantly changing, were of unequal quality, resolution, and even availability. And the complex reviews that FIFRA and the Endangered Species Act consultation process requires are very resource intensive, and any kind of addition of detailed information just makes them that much more demanding. So we needed more than a one-time aggregation of relationships or one-time look at crop data and where species are. We realized that, and we realized we had to do something more than just look at data or hand in a report. So not only do we have a complex array of organisms, not that the yak and rhino are of concern to us, but the blue whale and tortoises of one kind or another, all of the 1,600 or more species across the United States that are listed by the Endangered Species Act, and that many more and then some that are candidates, cause quite a bit of complexity. And under the Endangered Species Act and the way it's been promulgated, there's another thing we have to consider, and that is the availability of agricultural resources in light of having to protect species. So we do need to watch out both for the end user, which is the agricultural or homeowner community, or other uses such as mosquiticides or aquatic weed control, and be aware that not only do we have to protect the species that surround those activities, but we have to ensure that the activities themselves can be promulgated. So inside this very complex bubble that we're dealing with, we had the formation of the task force, the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force. At that time, there was no reliable single aggregated source of species data, and even the emerging satellite data that we take for granted these days on land cover and land uses was not as available. And in the environment of regulation at that time, there were two very different ways for EPA and the services to look at an assessment when it came to non-target organisms or species at risk. Typically under FIFRA, we approach a labeling assessment process with a series of scenarios that are meant to represent the range of the compound's use across the nation or across its area where it's labeled. And each would have within that exposure assumptions or exposure settings that are representative of a worst case within that scenario, so that we understand the worst possible thing that can happen, and nationally or within a geographic region within a scenario, we can register a product knowing that that rare case that happens will protect the organisms under those conditions if they occur. But more typically, the range of the label provides a safety margin for that kind of exposure across the United States, and then is adjusted within the ranges of frequency and rates and other things that are on the label, so that different rates can be used in different areas based on pest pressures, climate, and other things that come into play. In contrast, the Endangered Species Act looks at individual species that are in an area for an action on the ground. This works well if you're building a parking lot or looking at putting a bridge over water, but when you look from the national level across the United States at all the variables that could occur with a listed species, and there are 1,600 species and 500 or 600 different geographic ecosystems or more, ranges that vary, crops that vary from year to year, becomes a very, very complicated problem. But within those two cultures, EPA looking nationally at the worst case and the services looking specifically at a local base, is a very difficult gap to try to provide information to bring those two things together. So one of the overarching missions of FESTF was to close that gap with data, to provide data in an efficient, effective way that brings a leverage to the resources so that the agencies could better understand the situation before them. So this consortium of companies has grown to what we are now. I've shown them here, a list of companies, and there are also a number of companies that have made offers to pay to FESTF for more than 1,000 products. So we have a wide range of companies relying on our data, and we have a number of applications that we've developed to address the needs of the registrations of those companies. Addressing the needs of those companies really boiled down to not generating data as other task forces do, but to aggregate data and to find a way to deliver it efficiently. Data on listed species is distributed across the United States, and because the Fish and Wildlife and NIMS services agencies are oriented regionally, and the region calls the shots within their region because it is a specific decision for the region, the data is throughout those regions and not centrally organized in all cases. So getting to that data in some way was necessary so that it can be distributed across national platforms. And as we did that, we found that some species are very well studied and documented, while others are very poorly understood. And many details on species locations or ranges, populations, and other attributes are considered sensitive. So how do you array and deliver that data without putting the species at further risk from discovery and possibly poaching? So we had to answer those kind of questions along the way, more about what you do with data, how you handle it, how you deliver information from data without delivering the details of the data itself. Now that's become an issue these days when we start talking about big data. But many years ago, we were dealing with that on a different scale, but the same kind of questions had to be answered. And in the endangered species assessment, the data necessary to compare these species locations and the estimated exposure is not easily joined. And in a lot of ways, as we see the methods emerging at EPA for their interim process on endangered species assessment, they're still emerging and they're still being joined in a way that will give efficiency, logic, and reliable outcome in the assessment process. But on a more detailed scale, just rectifying nomenclature, updating intervals properly, spatial portrayal and resolution of data, these all need to be reconciled so that an efficient representative data set and comparisons from it can be made. So gathering, delivering, and keeping that data useful and current has been an iterative process, so to some extent still ongoing, and it changes over time. Out of this iterative process, we have a lot of data that FESTF has collected, and now we see that we have information aggregated on species location, biology, habitat, related details. We also have information on crop locations, relationships to surrounding land uses, and related details there. How we put those together is done in an information management system, a system that houses that information, can distribute them in response to specific questions. One of the important sources of data for the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force is NatureServe, but it's very interesting how that came about. There are two things I think that make it unique. The first is when EPA came about having registration requirements for endangered species, they were looking for a source of aggregated data and pointed to the possible development of such a source under a cooperative research and development agreement with the Nature Conservancy, TNC. At that time, the Nature Conservancy had gathered a lot of data on endangered species locations and species distributions because it supported their land acquisition process for protecting sensitive areas, providing reserves, and setting aside land for very rare and unusual species. Well, at the time, it turned out to be a pretty political process for the aggregation of that data under some kind of an entity. A number were proposed. There were some good people working out there, and I actually had one person come to me and say, "You do it my way and we'll both be rich." So I was really amazed and my eyes were opened about some of the things that people did in the name of conservancy. When I'm not saying anything bad about that, I'm just saying that whether it be in industry or conservation, we have good players and we have bad players. And that it takes a while, maybe sometimes, to sniff those out. But in this case, fortunately, I decided I didn't want to listen to the fellow that just wanted to make money. I wanted to listen to people that were really trying to get a good job done. And what that grew into was NatureServe. FESTF now has had a relationship with NatureServe for, over 15 years. And we've worked with them actually to improve their data set as they've worked with us to improve our aggregation and delivery of that data set. And it's been a good partnership and it continues. And mutually we grow as we continue to develop ways to deliver information as it is aggregated. And as these things have grown, one thing that's also grown is our understanding of information management. as well as the platforms that do that kind of work electronically. Most recently, we have come up with a new design, a very substantial redesign of where we started with the information management system. Initially, we decided that there was going to be no spatial analysis because at the time that was started, it was expensive, it was not commonly done, and we didn't have the tools that we have now to do that kind of an exercise. But Gopher does in a very nice and efficient way. Gopher is a new concept as well. Originally, we set up the IMS to address EPA's need for running an assessment, sat side by side with them and responded to how they wanted the system designed, but the system was very fixed and rigid, moving almost like a protocol from one step in an assessment to the next. And it just proved to be unwieldy as we moved through that process, particularly since it was not spatially based. But in doing that, we learned how the data worked, what kind of data we needed, and how we had to assess it. And now what we've done with Gopher, and the reason we have this logo, is it can go kind of in different routes to get different questions answered or answer the same question in different ways. It's very flexible, easy to use, intuitive, and built with the idea that it will change and mature over time. And it will be, and it is changing over time because we're dealing with multiple agencies. There are multiple needs. Laws evolve over time. We've seen many publications recently on new definitions under the Endangered Species Act. There's a revised interim method at EPA for the assessment of species. And FESTF responds to those in their design of the system. For example, with Gopher, we changed the way data were compared and arrayed in the overlap process based on changes in the interim process. These are responsive to agency changes, take a while to adapt, but we move them along as quickly as possible. It is an evolving process, and we are dealing with two unique environmental laws, and that is very challenging. What are some of those challenges? Well, there have been a number. We've needed to establish a process in a shifting sand. There is no protocol for what we're doing, and the methods are emerging as the agencies experiment not only with their own processes, but with processes that they develop as their relationships develop. Also, the turning of concepts into reality. The data even that we were dealing with was not a reality in an aggregated way until we were many years into the process. And conceptualizing what needs to be done with centralized or decentralized data so that it can be arrayed to answer different questions. Those were all mental challenges. We've also had challenges, I guess you would say politically, about trying to work with the agency, but not working with them too closely because we are not an advisory group. We want to learn from them. We aren't advising them. We're trying to implement what they need based on data requirements and available data that we can aggregate. We've also, one of the unusual situations we've faced is having a competing task force that's called the Generic Endangered Species Task Force, which has complicated things for the industry. But we believe that we have risen above those challenges, handled them well, and moved forward with a tool and data that are indeed helping the agencies and the registrant, and in a way, the end user by minimizing impacts on them, facilitating the registration and continued registration of pesticide products, and helping the process play out over time for valuable tools and valuable species protection. Along the way, we've learned that spatial data are adequate, but not always sufficient. Spatial data have limited availability in some cases. Half of the species, for example, have good spatial data available for them. And even crop spatial data, particularly on minor crops, it's not always well characterized, not always broken down into the units, for example, to protect species that might be associated with something like blueberries or a minor use of a pesticide in a minor crop. And the spatial data that are available have their own issues. For example, that's not always accurate. It's not easy to separate visually from a spectrum the difference between pear and apple orchards, for example. And also there are stray errors, stray pixels that create false impressions about where something is. For example, a county that has no wheat but has bunch grass or spotty grass occurrences may appear to have patchy wheat instead of grass in its borders, and thus if there is a wheat use on a label, that county might be flagged. Add to those learned lessons the fact that data in this world are always changing. They're not static. Species listings come and go. Species locations change. Climate might be driving them in one direction or another. Data sets are improved, are put together, are changed, and cropping trends change. Information technology advances. Satellite collection and resolution and availability of data changes. The big data approaches us. That's a huge change. Things that are definitely things we can use, but things that will grow to be something we deal with as we deal with the changing scenarios. So the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force is determined to stay involved with these changes, the growth in data, the updates of species, the data that shifts and methods that change. And I think a lot of it will be in a GIS environment, which as noted here, whose application is limited only by the imagination of those who use it. And we have a lot of hands on the data, a lot of imaginations putting ideas into the data, and a constant ability to improve thanks to our membership and the openness of the agencies to share with us the things that they need and how we might be able to help the process. Thank you very much. I entertain questions in some manner as this process goes on, and invite you to enjoy the rest of the meeting. Thank you.